The sound came just after midnight. 2 shots. That was how it registered to the people who heard it. The sound arriving in the particular way that gunfire arrived in the dark. Sharp and percussive and immediate. The kind of sound that sat you up in bed without the intermediate step of deciding to sit up. 2 shots, close together, and then a third, a few seconds behind, and then silence. Jonas Held was awake when it happened. He had been awake for an hour, lying in the dark of his cabin with the specific wakefulness of a man whose mind had found something to turn over and was turning it. The food stores, the calculation that had been occupying him since November, the count of what remained in the cellar against the count of what the winter still required. It was a calculation that, in the version he kept arriving at, did not come out well. There were 8 families in the valley, and it was the 3rd week of January, and the winter showed no sign of releasing its grip on the Ozark Hill country, and the stores that had seemed adequate in October looked different now, looked thin, looked like the stores of people who had underestimated the winter, or who had come into it without the margin that serious cold required. He had been lying awake with this calculation when the sound came. He was out of bed before the 3rd report finished. 14 years on the frontier had made certain responses automatic. A gunshot in the night was a problem requiring assessment, and assessment required being upright and moving. He went to the window and looked out at the valley. The night was the night of serious cold. No wind, no cloud, the sky clear and thick with stars in the way of winter nights in the Ozark Hill country when the temperature had dropped to the range that produced perfect stillness. The moon was down. The valley was shapes and shadow. Nothing moved. He stood at the window and listened. Silence. Not the 3-shot pattern of a man in trouble. That would have continued, would have been followed by shouting, by the sounds of alarm. Not the single deliberate shot of a hunter, though no man in the valley hunted at this hour in this cold. 3 shots, unevenly spaced, and then nothing. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he went back to bed, because there was nothing to do at midnight in January cold that could not be done better at first light, and because the silence that followed the 3 reports was not the silence of emergency. It was simply silence. He lay awake for another hour before sleep came. In the morning he would learn that 4 other people in the valley had heard the same thing. 3 shots, or 2 or 4, the count varying slightly with each account, in the small hours of January's coldest night. And then, nothing more. And in the morning, when a man named Cord went into the timber on the east slope to check a deadfall he had set the previous week, he found the first of the trees. The valley had been settled for 6 years. This was early settlement by the standards of what came after. The families who had come into this particular fold of the Ozark Hill country in 1829 and 1830 had arrived before the roads, before the county organization, before the infrastructure of commerce and governance that would make the country more navigable in later decades. They had arrived in the way that early settlers arrived, with wagons and tools and animals, and the understanding that what the land offered was what they would have, and that what it did not offer they would go without, and that the margin between adequate and insufficient was narrower here than it was in the more settled country they had come from. The valley was narrow and long, running roughly east to west, a creek down its center and limestone ridges on either side that gave it the enclosed quality of a place that managed its own weather. The timber was heavy. Old-growth oak and hickory on the upper slopes, cedar and sycamore along the creek bottom, the kind of forest that had been growing undisturbed for long enough that the trees on the ridge were the size of things that predated any human memory of the place. The families had cleared enough bottomland for their fields and their cabins. 8 structures spaced along the creek's south bank, with the practical logic of people who needed water and south exposure and some protection from the north wind. The forest was not background. This was the thing that people who came later, who lived in the valley after it had been more fully cleared and settled, sometimes failed to understand about what the early years had been. The forest was not scenery, and it was not obstacle, or not only obstacle. It was the substance of the life, the source of building material and fuel and food, and the raw material of the tools and furniture and structures that the valley required. The families knew the timber on their properties and on the shared slopes, the way they knew the creek and the soil and the weather, intimately, specifically, with the knowledge that came from depending on a thing for your survival. Jonas Held could tell you the location and approximate size of every significant tree on the east slope by memory. He had walked those slopes hundreds of times. He knew which oaks were worth harvesting for timber and which for mast, knew which hickories had the straightest grain for handles, knew where the deadfalls accumulated and where the game followed them. He knew the forest the way a man knew a place he had worked in daily for 6 years. So when Cord came back from the east slope that January morning with an account that did not fit anything Jonas knew about the forest, Jonas listened to the account carefully and then went to see for himself. Cord was a man of 40 who had come from Tennessee and who was not given to misreporting what he saw. He had found his deadfall empty and undisturbed, which was its own information, and on the way back down the slope he had found the tree. He described it to Jonas. Split down the center. Not fallen, standing. Both halves of the trunk still upright, still rooted, the wood between them exposed and pale in the winter light, as though the tree had been opened. He said, like something took an axe to it from the inside. Jonas went up the slope with Cord and found the tree. It was an oak, one of the old ridge oaks that Jonas knew. He had walked past this tree many times, had used it as a landmark on the upper slope. 4 feet across at the base, perhaps 70 feet of trunk before the first major branching, the kind of tree that had been growing in this location for a century at the minimum and probably longer. It stood now in 2 halves, each half still rooted, the split running the full height of the visible trunk, the heartwood exposed along the split's length, pale and clean-grained in the January light. Jonas stood in front of it and looked at it for a while. The wood at the split was dry, not the wet exposure of freshly broken wood, but not the weathered gray of old damage either. Recent. The split had happened recently, within the past day or 2 at most. The bark along the split had peeled outward in both directions, curling back from the exposed wood in a way that he had seen once before, years ago, in a tree that had been hit by lightning. He said to Cord, "Was there lightning last night?" Cord said, "No. Clear sky all night. You know that." Jonas said, "I know." He looked at the tree. He looked at the sky, visible through the canopy, flat white, the overcast that had moved in since the clear night, the sky of a day that was going to stay cold and gray. He looked at the tree again. He said, "There were other sounds last night. You heard them." Cord said, "I heard something. 3 shots, or like shots." Jonas said, "How far does that take us from here?" Cord looked at the tree and then looked at the slope above, them. He said, "I don't know." He said, "I think we should go up." They went up. The slope above the first tree gave way to the heavier timber of the upper ridge, the old growth that had never been harvested, that predated the settlement and the people before the settlement, and perhaps the memory of anyone who had ever tried to remember this country. The trees up here were the kind of trees that silenced people, not through any quality they actively possessed, but through the specific effect of scale and age on human proportion, the way that very old and very large things made the person in their presence aware of their own recency. Jonas had been in this timber many times. He knew it. He found the second tree 50 yards above the first. Same character, split vertically, both halves standing, bark peeled outward, heartwood exposed. This one was a hickory, smaller than the oak but substantial, the split running perhaps 30 feet of its trunk. He stood at the second tree and looked upslope. He could see from where he stood the shape of a third. He went to the third and found it the same. And from the third he could see a fourth, farther up the slope, the pale exposed wood visible even at distance against the gray-brown of the winter forest. He stopped walking. He stood between the third tree and the fourth, and turned slowly, looking at the slope around him. He was trying to count what was visible from where he stood, not going to each tree, just looking, taking in the scope of it. He could see 5 split trunks from where he stood. Perhaps 6. The pale exposed heartwood stood out clearly against the dark bark of the undamaged trees, each split marking itself the way a wound marked itself, the interior of the thing made visible. 5 or 6 from one spot on the slope. He turned to Cord. He said, "How many do you think there are?" Cord looked up slope, and then across the slope in both directions, scanning the timber. He said slowly, "More than we've found," Jonas said. "Yes," he said, "I think we need more people." They went back to the valley for more people. Nathan Gear was the man Jonas went to first, because Nathan Gear was the oldest settler in the valley. 61, had been in the Ozark country since before most of the other families had arrived, had come into this part of the hill country in the 1810s, and had lived through enough of its variations to have acquired the specific authority of a man who had seen things before. He was not a man who performed wisdom. He was a man who had paid attention for a long time and who knew the difference between what he had seen and what he was seeing for the first time. Jonas gave him the account. Nathan listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Show me." They went up the slope with 5 men, Jonas, Cord, Nathan, and 2 younger men named Pratt and Will Sutton, who had the energy for climbing and the competence for the woods that the situation required. They went up in the morning cold and found the first tree, and Nathan looked at it for a long time, without speaking. He put his hand against the exposed wood. He looked at the bark peeled outward. He looked at the sky. He said, "How cold was it last night?" Jonas said, "As cold as it's been, the coldest night of the year." Nathan said, "And no wind, no storm." Jonas said, "None." Nathan said nothing. He moved on to the second tree and looked at it the same way. Then the third. At the third tree, looking at the pale exposed wood and the peeled bark, he said, "I've seen this before. Once, not this many, but this." Jonas said, "What is it?" Nathan said, "In very cold weather, cold enough, still enough, a tree can split from its own frozen sap. The water in the wood freezes and expands, and the pressure builds until the wood gives." He paused. "It sounds like a rifle shot when it goes. That's what you heard last night." Jonas looked at the tree. He looked at the 2 halves of the trunk, the clean split running its full height, the heartwood white as new lumber in the gray winter light. He said, "I've never seen it." Nathan said, "It's not common. Takes a specific kind of cold, not just low temperature but sudden drop, fast, the wood not having time to adjust." He put his hand against the wood again. "But it happens." Will Sutton said, "One tree splitting I can believe." He was looking up slope, where the pale shapes of more split trunks were visible through the canopy. "How many are there?" Nathan looked up slope. He said, "Let's find out." What they found across the rest of that morning and into the early afternoon was not one or two trees. It was not the handful that the frost crack explanation could comfortably account for. Moving up the east slope and then across to the north-facing slope above the valley, counting as they went, the 5 men found 43 split trees by the time the light began to fail. 43. Jonas kept the count in his head and verified it with Cord at the end of the day, and Cord's count was 41. The 2 counts close enough to confirm the scale of what they were looking at. The trees were spread across perhaps a quarter-mile of hillside, concentrated on the upper slopes, but present at various elevations, oaks and hickories, and one massive sycamore near the upper creek that had split so completely that the 2 halves had finally given up their root hold on one side, and the tree lay half fallen, propped against its neighbor. That was the only fallen tree among the 43. The rest stood in their split condition, both halves still rooted, still upright, the white exposed wood marking them across the hillside like wounds. What they did not find was what Jonas had been half expecting to find as they went: the evidence of falling. A tree of the size they were looking at, 4, 5, 6 feet across at the base. When it fell with consequence. It broke other trees on its way down. It left a scar in the canopy where it had stood. It left an impact in the ground where it landed, a depression, disruption of the forest floor. He had seen large trees fall. He knew what falling looked like. None of the split trees showed this. He stopped at the 12th tree, or what he counted as the 12th, and crouched and looked at the ground around its base with the careful attention he had been giving to every tree. The snow here was thin, the canopy having intercepted most of the previous week's fall, and the leaf litter was visible at the margins of the trunk's shadow. It was intact. The fine structure of the uppermost layer, the individual leaves still partially identifiable, the network of twigs and small debris that composed the forest floor's surface, was intact in the way that it was intact when nothing had disturbed it in weeks. He pressed his hand against the exposed wood of the split. The surface was dry and cool, and had the quality of wood that had been open to the air for at least a day. Not the wet rawness of a very fresh break, but not old either. He looked at the bark curled back from either side of the split, the way it had pulled away from the exposed wood, the way it peeled. He had seen bark do this on a lightning-struck tree once, the force moving outward through the wood, the bark unable to contain it, the release going in the only direction available. Force moving outward. He stood up and looked at the tree and thought about that. About what it meant for force to move outward from the center of a tree. About what kind of pressure built at the center and released outward and left the ground undisturbed. He did not have an answer. He moved to the 13th tree. The forest floor around each split tree was undisturbed. The leaf litter, what remained of it under the snow, the accumulated leaves of previous seasons compressed into the forest floor, was intact. The branches of neighboring trees showed no signs of impact or breakage. The snow on the ground around each tree where it existed was smooth. Pratt said it, plainly, standing beside the 7th or 8th tree they had found. It didn't fall. It split, but it didn't fall. How does a tree this size split and not fall? Jonas said, the 2 halves are still held by the root system. As long as the roots hold both sides, Pratt said, I know that. He was looking at the tree with the specific expression of a man working through a thing that was bothering him. What I mean is, when the split happened, when the pressure released, that's where the sound comes from, right? The crack. He looked at Jonas. But a tree this size, when it cracks, it doesn't just crack. It moves. The wood separates. The bark tears. He made a gesture with his hands that approximated the movement he was describing. He said, "There should be noise." Jonas said, "There was noise. People heard it." Pratt said, 2 or 3 shots in the night. He looked up the slope at the visible splits above them. Not 43. This was the thing that settled into the group as the afternoon went on and the count grew, the arithmetic of the sound against the count of the trees. 5 families had heard something in the night. Most said 2 or 3 distinct sounds. One said 4. One said she had heard what she thought were 2, but could have been 1 with an echo. Even taking the most generous accounting, even granting that the cold, still air of the valley might have compressed multiple events into the impression of fewer, the gap between what had been heard and what had been found was too large to close. 43 trees, perhaps 4 sounds. Will Sutton said, near the end of the afternoon when they were making their way back down the slope. "I keep trying to make the numbers work." Nathan Gear said, and Sutton said, "They don't." He was quiet for a moment. "The frost crack. I understand that. Cold enough, fast enough drop. The sap freezes and something has to give. I understand why 1 tree cracks, or 2, or maybe 5, but 43 trees don't all crack at once. They crack in sequence or in clusters as the cold moves through the wood. Each one makes a sound." He paused, and we heard, not that. We heard a few sounds and then silence, and the silence lasted all night. Nathan said, "Yes." Sutton said, "So either most of them split without making any sound, or they made the sound and we didn't hear it." Nathan said, "Those are the options." Sutton said, "Which do you think it is?" Nathan was quiet for a while. They were descending through the heavy timber of the upper slope, the split trees behind them now, the valley coming into view below. He said, "I've been in these hills for 25 years. I've heard trees crack in cold. A big oak cracking in a still night carries a long way. You'd hear it in the valley without question." Sutton said, "So we should have heard 43. Nathan said, "Yes." He said, "We should have been woken up repeatedly all night, every family in the valley. The sound of a tree that size splitting in still air, it would have kept people awake." Sutton said, "But it didn't." Nathan said, "No." They walked the rest of the way down in silence. Jonas wrote his account of the day in the log he kept. A practical record, the kind of daily journal that a man who managed a farm and a family in a remote settlement kept for the same reason he kept his stores carefully counted. He wrote the account the same evening, before the details softened, and what he wrote was specific and unembellished. He wrote, 43 trees split on the east and north slopes. Frost crack, Nathan says, and I believe him. I believe that's the mechanism. What I don't believe, and what Nathan doesn't believe either, though he hasn't said it in those words, is that 43 trees cracked in the night, and we heard 4 sounds and then nothing. That is not the arithmetic of frost crack. That is something else, and I don't have a name for it. He wrote, the forest floor was undisturbed. This is the detail I keep returning to. A tree that size, when the pressure releases, moves. The wood separates. There is force in it. The branches move. The roots shift. The ground records it. Nothing recorded it. 43 trees changed last night, and the ground around them is as it was before they changed. He wrote, I don't know what to do with this. It happened in the night, and we did not witness it, and whatever happened left the forest changed and left no account of how it changed except the trees themselves. I have looked at the trees carefully, and the trees tell me what happened. They split. But they don't tell me how or why. or why we heard almost nothing, or why the ground shows nothing. He wrote, "It feels like the forest kept a secret, not from us specifically. The way a thing keeps a secret when it happens without witnesses, not hidden, just unwitnessed. Whatever moved through the timber on the east slope last night moved through it without us. We were here, 200 yards away, and we were not present for it. We slept through most of it, and the part we heard told us nothing." He wrote, "I am not a man who finds forests threatening. I have worked in timber for 30 years, and I have a respect for it that comes from that work. But this morning I went up the slope and found 43 trees that the night had changed, and the night had not told me it was doing it, and I found I was unsettled by that, by the scope of it, by the silence of it." He wrote, "The cold is explanation enough for what happened. I know that. What the cold doesn't explain is the silence, and the silence is the part I can't put down." The discovery of the pattern came on the second day. Jonas went back up the slope the following morning because he had not slept well, and because going back was better than lying in his cabin, turning over the count and the sounds. He went alone this time, moving through the split trees in the early light, looking at each one and at the ground around it, trying to find something he had missed the previous day. He was at the 17th tree. He had been counting again, confirming yesterday's count, giving himself something specific to do, when he noticed the direction. He had been aware, moving through the trees, that he was following a rough line, that the split trees were not scattered randomly across the slope, but were more concentrated in some areas than others, that moving from one to the next generally took him in a consistent direction. He had not examined this, had attributed it to the way the cold would have moved through the terrain, following the ridge, perhaps, following the contour. Standing at the 17th tree, he turned and looked back at the ones he had come from, and then turned and looked at the ones ahead of him. The line was not random. It ran northeast to southwest, along the ridgeline. Not perfectly. There were deviations, splits that occurred 20 or 30 yards off the main axis, outliers that didn't fit the line precisely. But the preponderance of the split trees described a path, a direction of travel through the forest. He stood in the January timber and looked along the line of pale, split trunks and thought about what made a path through a forest. Wind made paths. Wind came from a direction, and the trees that faced it took the most stress. But there had been no wind. Lightning made paths. Ground current spreading from a strike could affect trees across a wide area. But there had been no lightning, and lightning damage looked different from this. Something moving through a forest made a path. Animals made paths. The game trails on the lower slope were paths. People made paths by moving through the same ground repeatedly. He stood and looked at the line of split trees and tried to think of what moved through a forest and left only split trees and silence and an undisturbed forest floor. He could not think of what that was. He went back to the valley and told Nathan Gear about the line. Nathan came up and looked at it and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "It runs along the ridge contour, northeast to southwest." Jonas said, "Yes." Nathan said, "And the density, where the splits are closest together." He walked along the line, looking at the trees. He stopped at a point where 3 splits were visible within perhaps 20 yards of each other. He said, "Here, this is the densest point." Jonas said, "What does that mean?" Nathan said, "I don't know." He stood at the densest point and looked in both directions along the line. He said, "It means something was more present here than at the ends. If the frost crack followed the same cold through all the trees, I'd expect the spacing to be more uniform. This clustering, he paused. He said, "It looks like something slowed here." Jonas said, "Slowed," Nathan said, or paused, or turned. He looked at the trees. "I'm not saying that's what it was. I'm saying that if you walked into this forest without knowing it was frost crack, and you looked at this pattern, the word that would come to you is, something moved through here. And here is where it paused." Jonas said, "But there are no tracks." Nathan said, "No." Jonas said, "And whatever it was, it didn't touch the ground." Nathan said, "Or it moved in a way that ground doesn't record." They stood at the densest point in the line of split trees and looked at the pale exposed heartwood of the 3 nearest trees and at the undisturbed snow between them. Nathan said, "The frost crack is real. The mechanism is real. I've seen it before. The cold last night was sufficient for it. That part is not in question." He said, "What's in question is why 43 trees split instead of 3 or 5, and why they split in a line, and why the sound was almost nothing, and why the ground shows nothing." He said, "I have been in this country for 25 years, and I don't have an answer to those questions. I have seen cold do strange things. I haven't seen cold do this." Jonas said nothing. They walked the line one more time, end to end, looking at each tree in sequence, and then they went back down the slope to the valley. The split trees became part of the valley's winter that year, and a part of its longer memory after that. The immediate consequence was practical. Several of the split oaks were harvestable for timber, the clean heartwood exposed by the split usable, in ways that the intact tree would not have been, and Jonas and the other men of the valley spent part of the remaining winter getting what they could from the accessible ones. The higher trees, the ones on the steep upper slope, were left as they were. They stood through the rest of that winter, and through the spring, and through subsequent seasons, the two halves gradually diverging as each half grew in its own direction, the split trees becoming landmarks that the valley's children grew up knowing, pointing them out to each other the way children pointed out things that had happened before they arrived. The valley talked about it that winter with the sustained attention that a community gave to a thing that had happened in its midst, and that it could not account for. Nathan Gear's frost crack explanation was the explanation that the valley used. It was the only explanation available that had any mechanism behind it, and mechanism was what people wanted, what they reached for in the way that you reached for a foothold in difficult terrain. The cold was sufficient. The mechanism was real. It happened. But the frost crack explanation carried its freight of unanswered questions, and the valley knew this, and the knowing of it produced a specific quality of discussion, the discussion of people who had accepted an explanation because accepting it was necessary, and who had not pretended that the explanation was complete. At one of the winter gatherings, the informal assemblies around fire and food that the valley held through the cold months, the gatherings that served the same function as all such gatherings had always served, the maintenance of the community against the isolating weight of the season. The men who had been on the slope that first day gave the full account to the families who had not been there. Jonas told it in order. Nathan confirmed the parts he had witnessed. Pratt described the forest floor, the undisturbed snow around each tree, the branches of neighboring trees showing no damage. Sutton described the arithmetic, 4 sounds, 43 trees, and let it stand without commentary, because the arithmetic was its own commentary. The valley listened, then it talked. Nathan's son, a practical young man of 22 who had come into the valley the previous year, said, "I've heard of frost crack. My uncle in Tennessee talked about it. He said it was loud enough to wake the dead. Nathan said, "That's right." His son said, "So either our hearing is wrong or the count is wrong or something else is wrong." Nathan said, "Yes." His son thought about this for a moment and then said, "Which one do you think it is?" He was asking his father directly, with the directness of a son who had been watching his father's face all evening and who wanted the version his father actually believed, rather than the version his father was prepared to offer in public. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think it's something else. A woman named Elsa Pratt, whose husband had been in the timber on the first day, said, 'I don't think there's anything wrong with saying it was the cold, and also saying that the cold did something we don't understand. Those two things can both be true.' She said, 'The cold split the trees. I believe that. What I don't believe is that the cold decided to split 43 trees in a line and make almost no sound doing it. That part isn't the cold. Or it's the cold and something else that we don't have a name for.' Her husband said, 'What would the name be?' She said, 'I don't know. Maybe the name is just the forest doing something the forest does. Something it does that we don't have occasion to see very often.' She paused. 'We've been here 6 years. The forest has been here for longer than we can think about. Maybe there are things it does that aren't for us to understand. Things that happen in it at the level of,' she struggled for the word, 'at the level of the forest itself. Its own business.' The valley sat with this. Old Nathan Gear said, after a moment, 'I walked this ridge country for 10 years before any of you came here. I've seen it do things I didn't expect, things I don't have names for.' He paused. 'I've learned not to expect it to explain itself. It doesn't explain itself. It does what it does, and we see what we see, and the part we don't understand is usually larger than the part we do.' He said, 'The cold cracked those trees. Something in the cold, or something the cold made possible, cracked them in a line, and without the sound that cracking should make. I've lived in this country long enough to accept that, to hold it as a thing that happened and leave the explanation where it is, which is somewhere I can't reach.' This was the version of the account that the valley arrived at, eventually, in the way that communities arrived at accounts of things that exceeded their frameworks, not by resolving the thing, but by finding a way to hold it that was honest about both what was known and what was not. The winter ended in March. The spring came in the usual way, the creek running hard with snowmelt, the bottomland softening, the first green appearing at the margins of the timber in the way that green appeared after a serious winter, tentative and then insistent. The valley put in its fields and tended its animals and went about the work of rebuilding the stores that the winter had depleted. Jonas Held had kept his account of the January nights in his log and had added to it across the winter as new thoughts or observations came to him, and in the spring he closed the account with a final entry. He wrote, "We have come through the winter. The stores were thin, but sufficient. The families are all well." He wrote, "The split trees on the east slope are visible from the valley floor when the leaves are off, which they are now still. I can look up from the field and count the pale shapes on the upper slope. I have tried to see the line from down here, and I can almost see it, almost make out the direction it runs along the ridge. In a few weeks, the leaves will come in and cover them, and they'll be just trees again, or the trees they are now, and the summer will be between us and January." He wrote, "I still don't know what moved through the timber that night. Nathan says the cold moved through it. I don't disagree. But I think of the line on the ridge, and I think of the undisturbed ground, and I think of the 4 sounds we heard out of 43 trees, and I think the cold moved through it, and something else did too. Not something that harms, not something that announces itself. Something that was there before we were, and will be there after we are gone, and that passed through its own forest on the coldest night of the year, moving along the ridge the way things that belong to a place moved through it, without needing to leave a record, without making more noise than it chose to make. He wrote, "I keep thinking about the sound, the 4 rifle shots in the night. That was the only announcement. The rest was silence. 43 trees and silence. I lie awake some nights and try to hear it in my memory, try to reconstruct what 43 trees splitting should have sounded like, the sequence of it, the way it would have carried across the valley in cold, still air. I can construct it. I know what it should have sounded like, and what I remember from that night is nothing like that. What I remember is 3 sounds and then quiet. The quiet of a valley that had heard what it was supposed to hear and was satisfied." He wrote, "I think the forest allowed us those 3 sounds, as much as I was meant to hear. The rest moved through in the register that the forest used when it moved through itself, a register we don't have access to, that the cold air of January doesn't carry to the cabins along the creek. Not because it was hidden from us, because it wasn't for us." He wrote, "Whatever it was not for us. We were here and it passed through and it was not for us." He wrote, "I find I don't mind that. I have been in hard country long enough to know that hard country has its own life that doesn't consult the people who live in it. The valley doesn't owe me an explanation of itself. I am 6 years in, and it has been here far longer than that. And whatever happened on the ridge in January was the valley doing what it does when it does it, on its own terms, in its own time. I was awake for the edge of it, and that was what I was awake for." He wrote, "It's enough. The hollow kept its memory of that winter for the rest of its history as a settlement, which was longer than most. The valley remaining occupied through the Civil War and into the later decades of the 19th century. The families that came afterward inheriting the account of the January trees, the way they inherited the valley's other accumulated knowledge. The split trees on the east slope became landmarks and then became ordinary. As old strange things became ordinary, the valley growing up around them and past them, and the people who remembered the first discovery becoming fewer and then gone. But the story stayed in the way that certain stories stayed in small communities, not as ghost story, not as cautionary tale, but as simple local history. The kind of history that said, "This happened here once, in the winter, before most of us were here to see it." The detail that stayed most clearly through all the retellings and the accumulation of years was the silence. Not the trees. The trees were visible, were still there for decades, the landmarks that the valley's children grew up pointing at. Not the line along the ridge that required knowing where to look and what you were looking at, and the knowledge faded with the people who had walked it. Not the frost crack explanation, which was technically sufficient and humanly insufficient, and which people used and then quietly set aside. The silence. The valley had slept through most of it. 4 sounds in the night, perhaps 5 out of 43 trees that split on the coldest night of the year. The rest had happened in a quiet that the valley's light sleepers and its lying-awake farmers and its early risers had not detected, in a silence that had persisted through whatever moved along the ridge on that January night and had persisted after it was done, the hollow returning to the ordinary stillness of deep winter cold as though nothing had moved through it at all. This was the detail that Jonas Held returned to in the late entries of his account, and that the people who heard the story returned to when they heard it. Not the strangeness of the trees themselves, not the impossibility of the pattern, but the quiet, the specific quality of a thing that had happened at scale in a known forest and had happened quietly, in the way that things that belonged to a place happened quietly, without the noise that the same event would have made if the place had not been its own. The trees had split sometime in the night, and the hollow had slept through most of it, as though whatever moved through the forest that January had moved through it on its own terms, in its own register, making only the sound that it chose to make, leaving only the evidence it could not help but leave, present in the valley, and not for the valley, the way the oldest things in old country were present, already there when the first family arrived, still there when the last one left, patient in the way that forests were patient, which was to say in no hurry at all.